Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. This is Dr. Farhad with the course Fundamentals of Philosophy, and today we are here for lecture number 11. Just as a normal practice which we have been following from the start of our lecture series, let's have a look what we have discussed in our previous lectures, or especially because today's lecture is about, it's a continuation of the lecture number 10. So we have basically started the fundamental philosophies of the ancient times, and regarding that we have discussed the features or the components of three main philosophies, including Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy, and the Islamic philosophy. And then we have started the characteristics or the overall picture of the Greek philosophy. And regarding that, we have discussed that how in the ancient time in the Greece, when the people have started thinking and writing, and how the wisdom has emerged into the thoughts and in the expression of the people. And regarding that, we have discussed initially the human civilization and its impact on the Greek philosophy. And we also have discussed the dark era of the Greek philosophy, and the only writings which can be the main characteristic of the dark era was Homer and Hesiod's literature. Later on, we have in a previous lecture, in lecture number 10, we have started the archaic era, and regarding that we have discussed the initial two main philosophers who are considered to be the first philosophers of the Western philosophy, including Thales and Anaximander. And today we are going to continue the philosophers of the archaic era. But if we look back in our previous lecture, we already have noticed that in the archaic era, I mean that is being called as pre-Socratic era of the philosophy of the Greece. And in this Greek pre-Socratic philosophy, there were three groups of the philosophers. I mean, the one group is initially being called as the founder of the archaic philosophy. Rather, we can say the philosophers who have founded the thoughts into the Greek philosophy. And the second group was the group of those philosophers who basically have challenged the philosophy of the founders' philosophy. And later on, the third group was the synthesizers, who basically have synthesized the philosophy of the founders and the challengers. And we have started discussing the philosophers, the founder philosophers, including Thales and Anaximander. And today we will be starting the same founder group of the philosophy into the Greek archaic era, that is Anaximenes. Most of the facts according to the archaics or the archaeologists regarding the archaic philosophy of the pre-Socratic era, the Anaximenes was, I mean, the facts are not 100% true, but their estimated facts tells us that the Anaximenes was the student of Anaximander, and he was part of the Thales Academy of the Philosophy, that is the Miletus School of the Miletus Academy of the Philosophy. His time was in between the 585 to 525 BCE. Anaximenes was the, we can say, the last of the Miletus school. I mean, he was the last of the Miletus school, and he, just as I mentioned, approximately facts tells us that he was a student of the Anaximander. He basically lived for at least a part of his life under the Persian rule on the Greece, and we already know that this was the time of the very much distress and the chaos, and he also has rebellious aptitude against the Greek occupation of the Persia. And there are some evidences of the letters that he was in the communication with the Pythagoras, which inshallah we will be going to discuss after this of the discussion of the Anaximenes. Like the other malicious philosophers we already have discussed, he also was of the opinion of the monistic philosophy, and he believes in the one substance, origin of the one substance in the start of this world. And just like all other philosophers of the Miletus school, he also believed in the one substance of the origin of the life, that was, according to him, was not other than the air. I mean, unlike the Thales and the Anaximander, because according to Thales it was air, it was water, who was the first origin or the first substance of the start of this life, of the starting of this life, and the Anaximander, according to Anaximander, it was basically the Aperon. But unlike these two philosophers, the Anaximenes have the opinion that it is the one substance, it is the monistic substance at the start of the origin of this life, but that is not neither that is not water, nor it is Aperon, rather it is air. Okay, he could have no philosophical contact with Anaximander, according to some of the archaeologists. However, the conceptual link between them is undeniable. I mean, they have of the same opinion of the naturalistic philosophy and also the one philosophy, one substance philosophy. Just like Anaximander, Anaximenes thought that there were the something boundless and that was underlines all other things. Unlike Anaximander, Anaximenes made this boundless thing something definite as air. Just as I mentioned, because he was also one of the opinion of the monistic substance at the start of the origin of this life, but he was of the opinion that is not Aperon, rather that was air. And according to him, this earth, even this earth, and that air is basically the main component of this cosmological world. And why he think about the start of this life into this world as the origin of air, because he thinks that whenever man dies, when there is no breathing in his body. So upon this logic, upon this logos, he basically has discovered that air is the main essential of the human life as well as the cosmological world, and that can be the one substance of the start of the origin of this life into this universe. An Anaximenes claim that Earth is a broader disk. Even he talk about the circulation and the movement of the Earth, he says that our Earth is just like Thales. He was also of the opinion that Earth is a broader disk and it's floating. But unlike Thales, he was of the opinion that he is not, the Earth is not floating on the water, rather Earth is floating on the air. And all the sun, stars are formed by the same process of the condensation and the rarefaction of this process of the continuum change. Okay, he was of the opinion that all the natural changes, all the natural phenomena, just like earthquake, thunder and lightning, rainbows, that are basically occur because of the change, that was change into the earth that is floating on the air. Whenever the air basically fluctuates, it basically causes change into the movement of the earth, and then ultimately on the result, these phenomena, I mean the thunders and the light and the earthquakes basically occurs. If we remember regarding the philosophy of the Thales, he was of the opinion that our earth is basically floating on the water, and whenever there is a change in the motion of the water, our earth basically being caught by the natural phenomena and the natural disasters. So he was of the same opinion, but unlike Thales, he was of the opinion that this change is being occurred because of the fluctuation and the movement into the air. Okay, his contribution, his philosophical contribution, just as I mentioned, he was of the one of the philosophers who basically from the Miletus school of philosophy, and he basically was also of the opinion of the one substance, monistic one substance theory of the origin of this life. According to him, human beings are the micro version of the cosmos. I mean, this cosmos, this universe is a natural, it's being working on the natural, on the law of the nature, and all the human beings are also working on the same pattern of the cosmos. Body and soul both are made up of one substance, and according to him, that was the air. An examinees agreed to the unity of the opposite laws, just like an examiner. If we remember, examiner has given the idea of the logos, that there are two different opposites. The unity of the opposites basically causes the laws of the nature. He was also of the opinion of his teacher, examiner, with the addition of his the continuation of the chain occur as a result of the war of the opposites. Because if we remember the laws of the change in the opposites mentioned by an examiner, that there was a constant change and there was a constant contradiction in between the two forces, I mean two different forces with each other. But he added, the examinees added into this law of nature, that after contradiction of these two opposites, there was a change occurs. I mean, whenever these two opposites contradict with each other, there was a change occur because of the contradiction, because of the clash of these two opposites. Okay, in examinees, philosophy was centered on the theory of the change, and just as I mentioned, after the contradiction of these two opposites, there was a change occurs. I mean, ongoing cycles and defined by the movement of the air. And he says behind this change there was the movement of the air, because air is the basically start of the origin of this life. He was the first philosopher to attempt the scientific explanation of the rainbows. He said that whenever, and the only one to do until the Aristotle. I mean, before Aristotle, he was the one philosopher who has basically given the explanation of the rainbows. He described them as a reflection. He said the rainbow is basically the reflection of the sunlight of the clouds. I mean whenever the sunlight reflects on the clouds, it basically creates the reflection of the rainbows. And he theorized that the various colors were caused by an interaction of the light and the darkness. I mean, just like an examiner, because whenever there are some two opposites contradict, there comes a change. And he says that the rainbow change basically occurs because of the contradiction of the clouds and the sun. So here we can say these three philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, and Examenes, were the first archaic philosopher, and also they are being considered the first Western philosophers as who have basically started the thought process and the use of the reason into the human thought. And they belong to the Miletus school of the philosophy, and they have contributed, rather we can say they have initiated the thought and wisdom into the literature and into the philosophy of the Western school, or Western philosophy and the Western school of the reason. Okay, after compiling the Miletus school of the philosophy, including the Thales, Anaximander, and Examenes, there was another figure very much known to everyone who have basically studied the theorem, Pythagoras theorem. The one who studied the mathematics, they definitely know the name of the Pythagoras. So Pythagoras was also among the group of the founders of the archaic philosophy. And according to the facts, Pythagoras was born on the Greek island of the Samos, and in the eastern, we can say, Aegean Sea of the coast in modern day Turkey. And according to the most of the archaeologists, they have of the opinion that Pythagoras has traveled through the world, different parts of the world like Persia, India, and so many other places. So he has basically got an experience to meet the philosophers of the Indian philosophers and the Persian philosopher, and later on in his philosophy we can find the impact and the reflection of the Indian and the Persian philosophy as well. Pythagoras, according to some, there were many myths about Pythagoras, and he has very mysterious character into the history of the philosophy. Just like some people say that one of his leg was made up of gold, And just as I mentioned in the lecture of the Greek Dark Ages, there was a myth that he was the son of the god, we can say Olympic god Apollo, and he had the ability to travel through the time. I mean, this was also a myth about the Pythagoras, and there was another myth about him that he can talk to the animals as well, and also he also have the ability to travel to the time as well. So according to some of the reports, as a young man he met the Thales, the Miletus schools, the founder of the Miletus school of the philosophy, and remained student of the Anaximander as well. So we can call him influenced by the Miletus school of philosophy, but somehow his philosophy is some sort of different from the Miletus school of the philosophers. He was the first who has used the word philosopher for himself, because before Pythagoras, the only word that has been used for the wise people in the Greece was sage. I mean, the wise people and the intellect people were being called as a sage in the Greek society, but he was the first person who basically has used the word philosopher for himself. And we know that in the initial lectures we already have discussed the philosophy means a love for wisdom. So he basically adopted the word philosopher, the lover of the wisdom, the lover of the reason. He was the first one who has used this philosopher word for the sage, for the intellectual people, and later on this word has become so common that now the people know the wise people as the philosophers. And he was the first philosopher to establish his own academy. I mean, rather than following the Miletus academy, he basically established his own academy. And there was a reason behind the establishment of this academy, because he was among the community of the aristocratic group of the Athens, and especially the Greece. So in order to protect the cultural and the traditional thought, traditional values, traditional norms of the aristocratic group, he basically has established this academy. And there were only the people from the aristocratic group was allowed to be part of this academy. And interestingly, this academy also includes the women as well. But the purpose of this academy was just to protect the cultural and the traditional values of the Greece or the aristocratic community. He was one of the first who think that the earth was round. I mean, this is something he has basically first time initiated, and he has given the idea that this earth is round, that all the planets have an axis just like the earth. I mean, earth is being floating into its axis, and all the other planets also do the same, and that all the planets travel around the central point. And he also believed that the moon was another planet, and that he called the counter earth. I mean, the moon is the counter earth as a planet. Okay, he also believed, and this was his metaphysical or the physical theory, he also believed in the musica universals. I mean, once he listened to the music, and he found that there is a musical universals into the sounds of the music. The idea that the planets and the stars are moving according to the mathematical equation. He says that everything into this universe, everything into this life is basically the result of the mathematical equation. Even the movement of the sun, stars and earth, also the consequence of the mathematical equation. And even he considered that these musical notes and thus the also produce of the kind of the music because of the mathematical equation. Also, he was of the opinion that the human beings and the human relations can also be defined into the mathematical equations. Pythagoras was very famous for his religious and the scientific views, inseparably interconnected. I mean, he was the first philosopher who has interconnected the scientific theories with the religious philosophy. Just as I mentioned in the start that Pythagoras has traveled through the India and Persia, so he was very much influenced by the Indian belief of the transmigration of the soul. So he also believed in the transmigration of the soul and reincarnation. and again after death into the bodies of the humans, animals, and even the vegetables until it become moral. I mean, according to Pythagoras, the human soul is eternal, and it basically we can say it travel to the different bodies. I mean, the death of one body does not mean the death of the soul. Its souls basically travel to another body. And he also says that he also remember his 4 previous lives when his soul was being transmigrated into 4 different bodies. So he says that the same pattern, same law has been followed into the bodies of the animals and the vegetables, unless that soul attains the morality. And he was one of the first to propose that the thought process and the soul were located in the brain and not in the heart. I mean, he was the first who basically discovered that what you think is basically the reflection of your mind, your brain. He believed that the nature number system, and therefore, just as I mentioned earlier, was based on the sum numbers of to 4 and to the mathematical equation. Even he gave the attributes of the numbers to the relations. I mean, according to him, the odd numbers are the masculine and the even numbers are the feminine. So he basically has believe in the change and the start of and the laws of the change based on the mathematical equation. So this is basically all about the Pythagoras and his philosophy. Now the next philosopher is the Heraclitus, and he is also one of from the group of the founders of the archaic philosopher or the archaic philosophy, pre-Socratic time. His time was being in between 535 to 475 BCE. Okay, Heraclitus, just like Pythagoras, he also belongs to the aristocratic family, and he was a rich man. But unlike other aristocratic community or the people, he has nothing to do with his status and social, we can say, worth into his society. Rather, he basically believes in he devoted his life more about the philosophy rather than his social in securing or integrating his own social status as well. So Heraclitus is just like we can say he is from the Eleatic school of the philosophy, and I mean, about his death and the birth dates are the guesswork of the archaeologist. He was born, just as I mentioned, from an aristocratic family, and his father was a powerful man of the Greek, but unlike his father, he did not basically protected or safeguarding his prestige or his social status. Rather, he basically contributed towards the philosophical thought. He was known as a dark and obscure and the riddler. I mean, you might be surprised at what does it mean, the dark and the obscure and the riddlers. He was considered to be the dark because of his thoughts. I mean, his thoughts are usually very ambiguous and not clear. And he was obscure because of his contradiction in his thoughts and his philosophy. And he was a riddler because he used to write his writings, he used to write his philosophy in the form of the riddle. His philosophy can always be found in the form of the riddle. As a youth, he was we can say the prodigious intellect. He was an intellect person, and he claimed to have taught himself everything he knew by the process of self-questioning. According to the Heraclitus, he says that he knows everything by questioning himself. I mean, he thinks that he himself is enough to find out the answers of the philosophical questions. And he was something known as the obscure or the dark for the deliberately difficulty and unclearness of his teaching. Even today we can hardly can understand his philosophy. And he was also being known as a weeping philosopher as well. And why? Because according to some of the experts, he is the speculated and he was prone to the melancholia and the depression, and he was basically suffering with these two psychological disorders, which prevented him from the finishing some of his work as well. Heraclitus is famous for his natural philosophy, and his one of his the only book, single book he basically has recorded as his thought as being called as One Nature, and this book has been divided into three discourses. One of the discourses on the universe, another is on the politics, and the third one is on the theology. I mean, his nature also discusses the universe and then the politics and also the theology. Just like Thales and Anaximander, he was also of the, we can say, the founder, because he was the founder philosopher of the archaic era, and he also from the same opinion of the monoistic philosophy or the one substance theory of the origin of this life, just like Thales and Anaximander. But unlike all these three philosophers, I mean, Thales has suggested the one substance as a water, Anaximander suggested as an aperon, and Anaximander suggested as an aperon, and Anaximander suggested as an air. He was also of the opinion of the one substance and origin of this life, but he said that it is not water, nor it's the aperon or the air, rather it is fire. And he was of the opinion that fire is the origin of the one initial substance of the start of this life, because fire can change its form into the different other substance as well. I mean, when it basically become more blown, it basically turns into the earth, and when it's being cooled down, it's basically turned into the water, and when it's cooled down, become in the coldest form, it become an ice, and later it become an air when it's being blown. So he was of the opinion that the fire is the initial substance who has basically started life on this universe. Heraclitus believed that the world is not to be identified with any particular substance, just as I mentioned, but rather consists of the laws. I mean, there were laws of the chain, like interchangeably of the elements. Different chain of the different elements is basically the start of this life. An ongoing process governed by the law of the perpetual chain, or the logos, which is symbolized by the fire. I mean, he say initially it was fire, then it turned into the water, then turned into the ice, then it turned into the earth as well. So initially this substance was basically the fire. He uses the law of the monistic substance, just as the Thales, Anaximander and Anaximander, in the teleological, cosmological and the deontological field, in the good and the bad human being. He says that the human being also being reflected or being initiated, being formed by the fire. The good people are from the fire and the bad people are from the water, and most of the people are in between the water and the fire. Okay, so far as Heraclitus' philosophy about the logos, the writing of the Heraclitus was the first place where the term logos was being given special attention in the ancient Greek philosophy, because earlier it was being defined as a reason, as an intellect, as an argument. But he believed that the logos, I mean the reason and the argument, as a law of nature and orders of the knowledge. I mean, he says that just like Anaximander, because according to Anaximander there was a change in the both opposites and their contradictions. He says that law of nature, of the order of the knowledge, is basically occurs because of the law of the logos. He uses the word logos for the God, and interchangeably. He says that this word, I mean this logos, always holds the human, and always the human always being unable to understand. I mean, even he says that this logos, this laws of change is being we can say controlled by the logos itself, and that logo also being attributed as a god according to Heraclitus. Heraclitus is also famous for his dialectic method, and we know the dialectic method in the philosophy is very famous, and later on there was much studies have been done on the dialectic method. He was also of the opinion of the dialectic, and dialectic we already knew that dialectic is basically two different opinions. I mean, based on the two logos is the dialectic. And when we say dialectic, he says that dialectic method is basically the start of this working as a law of the nature, and it also working up till now as well. And he says even the God is at the same time day and night, the God is death and life, and God is even the good and bad as well. He is known as the father of the dialect. I mean, according to him, the laws of the two opposites and two different opinion and the two different laws are in behind the process of the working of this universe. He says that everything flows. I mean, in the result of this opposites law of nature, I mean the day and night, the good and bad, and life and death. He says after in result of this law of the dialectic, there is a motion in the existence of all things. I mean, all things are being moved because of the change of this dialectic logos. He says that every new water flows on those who step into the same river. I mean, he says that we cannot step into the same river twice. This can also be said like this. I mean, the first step of our river, the water was not the same when we stepped the second time into the river. At the same time, he says, when we have stepped into the water, and the second time when we have stepped into the water or into the river, we are also not the same. So he says, by every moment, by every time, the things and even the human beings are being changed. So we both step and do not step into the same river. Just as I mentioned, they both have been changed, and we are not, according to his philosophy. No man ever step into the same river twice, according to the dialectic philosophy of the Heraclitus. So Heraclitus recognizes the law like flux of the elements, just as I mentioned, with the fire changing into the water and then into the earth, and then earth changing into the water and then into the fire again. So this is the change of the flux. So while parts of the world are being consumed by the fire at the given time, and the whole remains. I mean every now and then when it's being consumed by the fire, and then it basically also remains into another form. Heraclitus does, and be sure, make paradoxical statements. I mean, his statements are paradoxical with each other, but his views are no more self-contradictory. I mean, he says the examples of the paradoxical to the form of the paradoxical statements, but his philosophy was not self-contradictory. That was basically a continuation of the previous thought. He was one of the first philosophers to make human values a central concern. He viewed that the soul as a fire nature. I mean, the soul is basically the nature, having the nature of the fire, and generated out of the substance of the fire, just as fire, but limitless and dimension. Thus, he says that their soul is being affected by the human behavior. If the drunkenness is, for example, damages the body, it also damages the soul as well, and causing the moist into the soul, while the virtuous life keeps the soul dry and intelligent. Okay, this is all about the Heraclitus. Okay, if we look at these all philosophers, including starting from the Thales, and then Anaximander, then Examenes, then Pythagoras and Heraclitus, these are being called as from the group of the founder into the Greek archaic philosophers. Next group that is being considered as the challengers. I mean, the next group of the philosophers are the challengers. They have basically challenged the philosophy of the founders philosopher. I mean, including dialectic philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, and Examenes, Pythagoras, and Heraclitus. Among them, that includes the Parmenides and Xenophanes and the Zeno of the Iliad. These are the philosophers being considered as the challengers into the group of the archaic philosophy. So far as Xenophanes as a philosopher is concerned, he was just we have mentioned that the philosophy of the Heraclitus was found in the form of the riddle, but the philosophy of the Xenophanes is found in the form of the poetry. According to the archaeologist, his time was in between 570 to 470 BCE, and he was basically the rebellious philosopher into the archaic era. If we remember, we have mentioned in the Thales philosophy that Thales has not contradicted the mythological and the religious thought of the Greece, of the Athens. But unlike Thales and all founder philosophers, the Xenophanes has clearly contradicted. He has basically presented the rebellious philosophy against the Greece religious beliefs and the Greece religious environment. He was a poet and a religious thinker. He was also being considered as a religious thinker, and why he is being called as a religious thinker, because he challenged the pagan philosophy of the Greece. He challenged the Greek religious fatalism, immortality of the gods and the goddess, especially the Homer and the Hesiod. He says that the Homer and the Hesiod's philosophy is nothing, and the god and the goddess cannot be the cruel, cannot be reflect and represent the human attributes. Xenophanes was the first Greek thinker to offer a complex and least partially systematic account of the divine nature. He says that God cannot, having the attribute of the human beings, he identified God as the one greatest God. He says that he is eternal and he is there at the start of this world, and he will be there at the end of this world, with the entire physical universe often termed and the whole and all things. He has basically attributed the God as the one, the greatest and the whole, and having attribute of the all things. He also being considered as the founder of the skepticism. If we'll inshallah discuss in the Hellenistic era, the skeptic school of the philosophy, and Xenophanes has been mentioned, has been considered as the initial thinker as a skeptic. Why he is being considered as a skeptic? Because he says that there is nothing anything lives like the reality, truth and the knowledge. I mean, he says you may think that you know, but that might be your opinion. So there is a difference between the opinion and the knowledge, and he says we cannot attain knowledge because of our opinion. I mean, there is nothing exists as a knowledge being called as a truth. So everyone who thinks that he knows, that might be his opinion, but not the absolute, but not that cannot be called as absolute knowledge. So this thought has basically influenced the later on in the Hellenistic era, and a full philosophical thought, full philosophical school being established during the Hellenistic era. He identified as a founder of the Eleatic philosophy, and primarily on the testimony of the Aristotle, whose views were Xenophanes also anticipated. So we can say that he basically has challenged the mythological philosophy and the beliefs of the Greece and the Athens, and he basically has challenged the philosophy of the Homer and the Hesiod. So that's why Xenophanes is basically called the first philosopher who being considered as a challenger of the founder philosophers. Then Parmenides, and he was also being one of the challenger philosopher among the archaic school of the philosophy. His time was in between 515 to 660 BCE. He was an early pre-Socratic Greek philosopher and founder and the chief representative of the Eleatic school of the ancient Greek philosophy, and he was very much influenced by his teacher Xenophanes. And he is sometimes referred to the father of the metaphysics as well, because he has given very interesting theory of the being and not being. Likewise, the phenomena of the movement and the simply appearance of the real, static, eternal and reality. He further asserted that truth cannot be known through the sensory perception, only through the pure reason. So if we remember, we have also studied this concept of the logos, in the philosophy of the Heraclitus, but he has challenged the philosophy of the Heraclitus in his philosophy. He says that there is a logos, there is a reason, and there is a law of the nature works, but that is not motion, that is static. I mean, the motion is not being considered as the law of the nature. There is a static nature which has basically defines the reality of the things. So he says that what is not, that is not, does not exist. I mean, that what is not, it does not exist. Since anything that comes into being must arise out of what is not, and objects cannot come into being, likewise they cannot pass away as well, because in order to do so they would have to enter the realm of what is not. So this is might be confusing you, but we let's explain it in this form. He basically has given the reality is like a sapphire. He says there is a reality, there is a being into the form of a sapphire, and that is being called as Parmenides metaphysics. He says the being and the nothingness as a measurement to evaluate. He says that first he examined the being and not being. Later on he basically the not being and the being. And according to his measurement, he says that the being what is, I mean the things that we can see, what we can feel, what we can know, that static into our naked eyes, they are being considered as being. And secondly, he says the things which cannot be accessed, that cannot be felt, that cannot be watched, they are considered not being. And if they cannot be visible, they cannot be felt, they cannot be smelled, then they are not being considered as a being. I mean, that is called being Parmenides metaphysics, metaphysical philosophy. So he says that non-being has no properties. I mean, the being has a property of the solidness, of the hardness, or the being to be touched, to be felt. But the not being have no such characters. So the thing that is not being, that cannot be exist. So Parmenides argued that the everyday perception, I mean, he says you could not know what is not. I mean, you cannot feel, you cannot know the thing which is not exist, the which is not being, and nor can you say what cannot be thought, cannot exist. I mean, the thing which cannot be thought, that cannot be exist as well. Since we cannot think of nothing, therefore there can be no void and the vacuum. There is no vacuum, there is no thing which does not exist in our thought. So his basically the principle of non-contradiction based on the contradictory statements cannot be true in the same sense at the same time. For example, the true proposition A is A and A is not A as well. So if we remember the Heraclitus theory of the motion, he says everything is into the motion and we are changing every moment. But unlike, he has basically channeling the philosophy of the Heraclitus, he said that there is no motion, there is a static we can say reality, and that is basically exists, and we cannot change that reality. That is exists, that exists. If that not exist, that cannot be exist. And he also argued that the everyday perception of the reality of the physical world is mistaken. I mean, what you perceive by your perception is a mistake, and that the reality of the world is the one, and the unchanging, ungenerated and indestructible whole. So just like his father, his teacher Xenophanes, he also believed that there is a law of change being generated by the one, and that is indestructible, unchangeable. So we are basically the result of that logos, we are basically the result of that law, but that is not changeable. I mean, that is static, and that exists as a static reality, and the reality we does not thought to be exist, that cannot exist. I mean, only thing that exists but we can think that it exists. So this is all about the challenger philosophers of the archaic philosophy, including the Xenophanes and the Parmenides. Now the third philosophers are being called as synthesizers, and who basically have synthesized the philosophy of the founders and the challengers. They are being called as Empedocles. I mean, the one philosopher that is being called Empedocles, and according to the archaeologists, his time was in between the 490 to 430 BCE. And Empedocles was very familiar with the work of Eleatic school and the Pythagoras. He was very much impressed by the Pythagoras and his work, and particularly he was also being very much we can say into the interest of the work of the Parmenides, who were basically the challengers. If you remember, the Pythagoras was the school of the founders and the Parmenides from the group of the challengers. So like Pythagoras, Empedocles believed in the transmigration of the soul, but he also believed in the change of the Parmenides school of the philosophy. He is perhaps best known as the originator of the cosmogonic theory of the four classical elements of the ancient world, that is combination of earth, air, fire and water, and which becomes the standard dogma for much of the next 2000 years. I mean, that was remained the subject of the discussion and the philosophy for next 2000 years. He is also credited with the several we can say present ideas in the physics, which was being since proved quite prophetic as well. So he has basically synthesized the philosophy of the founders and the challengers, and he has given the idea of the laws which basically they started the origin of this life, being considered as a combination of the all four substance, including earth, air, fire and water. So Empedocles believed that wise people, his axiological ideas based that the wise people who have learned the secret of life are next to divine. They also reflect the divine qualities, and their souls free from the cycle of reincarnation, just like Pythagoras. If you remember, he was very impressed by the transmigration of the belief or the philosophy of the Pythagoras, but he said that the wise people who basically migrate, who basically change their behavior according to their philosophy, their wisdom, they are free from the cycle of the reincarnation and transmigration of the soul, and they can easily able to rest in the happiness for the eternal life in the eternity. So Empedocles held that the change, including the what we call coming into the existence and death, and is not only the mixture and the separation of the four indestructible and unchangeable elements, and the roots called earth, air, fire and water. Just as I mentioned, he has basically synthesized the philosophies of the previous philosophers. He basically of the opinion that two divine powers, which are love and strife, they work together for the change as a logos into the law of the nature, which basically pervades the universe and act the moving powers which bring about the love mixture and strife separation. He says that when there will be love, it basically joins the laws of the nature, and there will be strife that will basically separate the laws of the nature as well. So if we look at the archaic philosophy, this is the conclusion of the archaic philosophy. Initially there were founders including Thales and Anaximander and Examenes, Pythagoras and Heraclitus, and later on being challenged by the philosophers of the we can call it the challengers, the Parmenides and the Xenophanes, and then later on it is being that their both philosophy has been synthesized by the Parmenides. So this is all about for the archaic philosophy. Inshallah, we'll see you in the next lecture with the philosophy of the classical era, that is the Socratic era. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.